Hello, good morning. Welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna episode number 165. This week we are looking at Sutherland poor reliefs records. So welcome to Learn with Lorna. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. The Highland Archive Service has 4 archive centres where we look after the historic records of the Highlands of Scotland. Our centres are in Wick, in Portree, in Fort William and in Inverness. And this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. But if you're able to donate towards our work, and many of you have done, thank you so much for doing so. There's a link to be able to do so, whether you're watching live on Facebook within the comments or whether you're watching on YouTube subsequently. So thank you very, very much. It's so greatly appreciated. Stuart, what you're saying, you've missed too many of this series. Well, you can go back and catch them all on YouTube. No pressure. So yes, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you for all the comments on last week's episode as well. Last week I was looking at connections to New Zealand and Australia, and it was so nice to look back over loads of people's stories and personal connections between Scotland or Ireland and those countries. So it was really lovely. So thank you very much for doing that. And please always know that I will come back and look at them after the talk is over. So this week, as I mentioned, we're looking at something totally different, although perhaps linked for many people. The relief of poverty in the county of Sutherland over the centuries, over the years. And the reason I've picked Sutherland is for no particular reason other than it helps me to kind of group and narrow the focus so that I'm looking in one's collection of records rather than just poor relief generally. So it's not because there was any more poverty in Sutherland than anywhere else, but just that's, like I say, helps me put it together. So we're going to look at whose responsibility was it to support those who were struggling, those who had lost earnings through illness or through old age or through carrying a child, who supported orphans over the centuries, who looked after those who were single mothers and had no support at home. And whose responsibility was it, but also how did that support present itself? Well, as always, as I say every week, the answer changes over time. So it depends at what time period you're looking at who is responsible for that. I want to start by reading an extract from the National Records of Scotland website, one of their brilliant research guides. I've spoken about them several times. If you're looking at something like migration, poor relief, police records, court records, there's a brilliant series of research guides on the National Records of Scotland website which will give you an overview of the subject. And rather than me invent the wheel and reword this, it makes sense for me to just read this, which outlines the situation of who was responsible for poor relief within Scotland from the 1400s onwards. This section is entitled Old Poor Law. The first Acts of Parliament to deal with the relief of the poor were passed in 1424. Most of these and subsequent acts in the 15th and 16th centuries were aimed at dealing with the problem of sturdy beggars. Few records detailing individuals survive from this period. After the Reformation, the responsibility for the poor fell on the parish, jointly through the heritors, the local landowners, and the kirk sessions. The heritors often made voluntary contributions to the poor fund in preference of being assessed, having a tax taken on their land, or taken on them as landowners. Kirk sessions were church courts, responsible for moral discipline in each parish, but they were frequently the primary source of support for the poor. They, either solely or in conjunction with the heritors, operated a poor's fund. Income was raised from church collections, fines on offenders, and fees for carrying out sacraments and services, like the use of the mortcloth for funerals. We'll come back to that. Some parish poor funds were endowed by mortifications, bequests by wealthy parishioners or former parishioners. Heritors' records seldom survive before the late 18th century, but their minutes, accounts and other papers can include lists of the poor, assessment rolls and discussion of poor relief and related problems such as crop failure or hardship caused by trade depression. Kirk Session minute books and accounts will typically include weekly or monthly lists of paupers, residents and often unnamed poor too, as well as sources of poor fund income. So that's the state of play from the 1400s through to 1845. The local Kirk Session is administering poor relief with the assistance and the financial support of local landowners, the heritors. So if you're researching poor relief, either for family history purposes or for social history for this period, then the Kirk Session is a really good place to start looking at this. So if we take the county of Sutherland as an example, as I said, which Kirk Session records can we look at that will tell us something about the care of the poor at this time? Well, we hold Kirk Session records for the parishes of Tongue, Durness, Golspie, Lurg, Kildonan, Creech, Assynt, Store and Dornoch. So a wide range of records actually for the county of Sutherland. And all of them will contain references to poor relief, whether that is collections of money or lists of those who are receiving the assistance. And what that illustrates is the fact that there's a pot of money in each of these parishes which fluctuates. So there may be times where there's a lot of money being put in and few people pulling on it. There may be times when there's huge numbers of, huge amount of demand, but not much in the pot. So it's very much a movable feast. If we have a look at the Durness Kirk Session minutes for the mid-1700s, you can see a fascinating insight into that movement of money, and like I say, the fact that this is not a set amount. We can find that there are numerous payments, so that the volume will be laid out much as you would expect an account book, with one side showing the incoming money and one side showing the outgoing. And if we look at the money that's incoming in Durness in the mid-1700s, you can see numerous payments of fines for wrongdoing coming in. So for instance, in November 1765, David Sutherland paid 8 shillings and 4pence. Barbara Bain paid 10 shillings. Elizabeth Roy paid 10 shillings. Barbara Morrison paid 2 shillings. So you can see the money coming in for people paying a fine for committing some kind of moral breach. If I had chosen to, I could have probably gone back through the minutes to find exactly what each of them had done and then work out what the fine had been for each of those things. The other thing we can see is that from Martinmas, which is November, from Martinmas 1765 through to August 1766, that the offerings collected in Durness Church amounted to £1, 3 shillings and 8pence. There are also records of payment for baptisms and for marriages, as well as notes of bonds being paid in by Lord Ray to the Kirk Session. So exactly as that extract from the NRS showed, you can see money coming in from bequests, coming in from landowners, payments for fines, payments for church services, and so on. So we can see how the money was amassed, and then we can look at how it was spent or distributed. So the other side of that page shows money paid out for sackcloth, which presumably was for all those wrongdoers to wear in front of the congregation. Payment on travel and expenses, going to far, I found, taking the express to Edrehillis. Receipts for payment of repairs to the church or to the school building. So there's the church's responsibility for repairing, keeping on top of the maintenance of those buildings. But by far the biggest payments that are going out of the church are to support the poor of the parish, either through monetary payment directly or in other ways. So for instance, we see on the 4th of August 1766, £1, 3 shillings and 8pence given to the poor. And that's all it says, given to the poor. And as I say, if I had gone right into the minutes, I would probably find the list of everybody it was given to. On the 23rd of February 1767, we can see a less direct way of supporting. So it says, a coffin and linen provided for the late George McWilliam. So you can see that as well as just giving money, they're supporting in other way practical support. There are payments for balls of beer, which is barley, and for furlots of oatmeal to be given specifically to the poor. So there's support in the form of food. There's payments to support widows and sometimes widowers, but generally widows. Payments to Robert Munro's surgeon for curing 2 poor men. Payments for shoes to Angus Cooper and a plaid for George Mackintosh's son. Payments to Barbara Munro to help her son get into a trade. There are payments, as I mentioned, for coffins and linen wrappings for those who can't afford them. There's also reference to items that the parish would purchase, they invested in, so that the poor could hire them. So for instance, in Durness Kirk Session, there's a reference to the 1780 purchase of a bier for the dead to be carried on. The Galsby Kirk Session records the presence of 2 large and 1 small mort cloth gifted by the Earl of Sutherland to the session on behalf for the use of the poor. So the cloth used in the funeral practices, which the poor could hire rather than have to purchase. And I was really interested, because my life is very strange, I was really interested to read that in 1758 that Galsby Kirk Session paid £1 16 shillings and sixpence for the best Persian silk for the mort cloth, which I just thought was really interesting, that they had invested in the best Persian silk for something that was to be hired out for the poor to use. There's something there around maybe a bit of dignity in death. There are some quite affecting and some quite intense wording to be found in these Kirk Sessions. So quite often they'll talk about supporting distressed objects or distressed poor. Payments to strangers in greatest misery. Tenants who are so very poor. That's exactly how it was worded, and I thought it's just a really interesting intensifier to say that they are so very poor. In Creech Kirk Session in 1838, there's a minute recording that a final contract had been entered into with Alexander Mackenzie, Wright, Migdale, for making the coffins for the poor at 7 shillings and sixpence each. And it goes on to say that he is not to charge the session for any coffins without having previously had an explicit order from the session to make such a coffin. So you can see from those examples from across the county how central the church was in providing relief to the poor, distribution of poor relief finances, and also all of those practical things. And all of those examples that I've mentioned are interspersed with lists of the names of those who are on that parish's poor roll. And sometimes even there's references to their age, their condition. It really depends, like all collections, it really depends who's writing. Now, this role, the role that the church played, was to change with the coming of the Poor Law Amendment Act Scotland in 1845. So let's go back to the National Records of Scotland, the research guide, and read their overview of what happened next. Following the Poor Law Amendment Scotland Act of 1845, parochial boards were set up in each parish to administer poor relief. To begin with, record keeping didn't change much, and there was a lot of overlap between the records of parochial boards, heritors and kirk sessions. As representatives of heritors and kirk sessions were on each parochial board, and the session clerks often acted as clerks to the parochial board and clerks to the heritors meeting. It's the same thing that I always say, it's a small handful of people with a finger in every single pie. Records of parochial boards and their successors in 1894, the parish councils, are generally found in local authority archives, but there are some in the national records. In 1865, standardised poor relief registers were introduced in the parochial boards throughout Scotland. However, it can still be worth looking at the heritors' records, looking at the kirk session records for evidence of poor relief right up until the 1920s. Each parochial board had to keep a roll of the poor to whom it gave relief, and these can contain a considerable amount of detail about each pauper: their name, age, country and place of birth, marital status, details of spouse and children. The records may also include applications of those who were not successful in applying. And as that that extract says, the role of the church did change, but there does continue to be an overlap as the state takes over. And if you think about it now, you know, the church still plays a role in supporting people who are in need, whether that's locally or further afield. But that crossover we can see a great example of in this extract from the Crieff Kirk session. At the Church of Crieff, the 22nd day of February 1845, so exactly at the point that that piece of legislation has come in. The session being met in consequence of notice given from the pulpit on last Sabbath and constituted by prayer. Present the minister, the elders and the heritors. This meeting being called for the purpose of transferring the poor's funds from the Kirk session to the heritors of the parish of Crieff, to be managed and distributed by them as they shall see cause for behoof of the poor. Always love that, on behalf of the poor. The Kirk session accordingly receive the acknowledgement of the heritors for the said fund and consign the fund to them as follows. So they've called a meeting because the Kirk session is handing over the responsibility to the landowners. At Crieff, 22nd day of February 1845, in a meeting of the Kirk session and heritors of the parish of Crieff, duly intimated by citation from the pulpit. Present Reverend Murdo Cameron, moderator of the Kirk session, George Dempster, Esquire of Skibo, Daniel Gilchrist, Esquire of Obsdale, George Gunn, Esquire, factor for His Great Grace the Duke of Sutherland, and Mr. Duncan Ross, elder and session clerk, constituted by prayer. The meeting is of the opinion that it is desirable that the future administration of the poor's funds of this parish should be delegated to a committee of heritors, as is done in some Scottish parishes. And the moderator of the session having expressed his concurrence therewith, the meeting constituted and appoint George Dempster, Daniel Gilchrist and George Gunn Esquires a committee for this purpose. George Dempster to be the chairman and convener thereof, and also Mr. George Forbes, factor, to be the treasurer to the said committee, with full powers to them to receive all monies on behalf of the poor's fund, to apply relief thereupon to the poor as they shall find needful and expedient, and to revise from time to time the poor's roll, and to add thereto or remove therefrom such as shall or shall not appear to require parochial aid. So exactly as that NRS summary said, a moment of the church saying, let's hand this over to the heritors. But although that the heritors and the Kirk session there retained some control, it really meant that 1845 Act, that the role of supporting the poor moved to the newly created poor relief system. People would have gone through the process of applying for help, being investigated by the local inspector of the poor, which would be then recorded in the applications for relief. They might have been given some immediate assistance at that point, or it might have been referred to the next meeting of the parochial board to discuss the case, in which case we might find something about it in the parochial board or parish council minutes. So the process goes from the application to discussion. If the application was successful, the applicant would then be placed on the general register of poor for that parish and receive either outdoor relief, which would be they would remain in their own home, or indoor relief, where they would be moved to the poorhouse. There were varying kind of small poorhouses across Sutherland over the decades, and then the Sutherland combination poorhouse from 1865 onwards, which was numerous Sutherland parishes coming together to create a larger poorhouse. So a successful applicant would be put on the general register of the poor. If they were a child, they would be put on the children's separate register. Now, the cause for people claiming for support could be something indefinite, like old age, something that's not going to change. Or it could just be until an individual's situation improved or changed. So, for instance, if an orphan came of age, or someone who had an injury and couldn't work, when that healed and they could go back to work. So you can see examples of both of these, and I'll come on and share some. I think one of the main things to get across really is that it was a humiliating process. This was a process where the people who had the authority and the power to make the decisions also tried very hard not to have to pay out. They looked into every other alternative, because although I mentioned there at the beginning with the churches, where that's a very changeable pot of money. By the time we come to the poor relief official system, there's still an issue of going, look, we've only got limited resources and we can't give it to everybody. So they're looking very hard at ways that they can not have to pay. Did the applicant have children who could support them? Did they have a bit of land that they could work? Did they have livestock or a single animal that could produce milk or meat? If they were ill, could they still be working anyway? You find a lot of investigation into the person's story to see if there's another way that that money can be raised. And as I say, the thought of having to go in a small community, particularly, to people that you knew and say, I'm absolutely desperate, that the ultimate indignity would be having to go into the poorhouse. Now, like all subjects, what we can find depends on what records have survived. But the coverage for post-1845 poor relief records for Sutherland isn't bad at all. And there are some areas, some parishes, which are particularly rich in the record series. So some that have the applications, the minutes, the general register, the children's register. And there are numerous others that might have just the minutes and the applications, or just the applications and the general register. As always, it entirely depends on what's been kept and what survives. So if we come now to look at those official poor relief records, let's see what stories we can find in there. And sometimes people say to me, do you feel bad kind of telling the stories of people when they are suffering? And I know I've mentioned this before. And I don't think that, whether it's asylum records or poor relief records, I don't think that suffering or going through a time of hardship should make your story any less valid. I think we need to talk about those stories as well. So let's have a look through these. First thing to say is that a flick through any of these volumes, the poor relief volumes, will show the diversity of the people who needed help, which makes sense because some hardships we can predict. As I say, you might know that you're going to be a bit more strapped for cash if you have to be off work with an injury. You might know that if you're having a child and you can't work, there's a ramification there. And some of the things come upon us much more unexpectedly, so you might suddenly have a moment of crisis or a bereavement that means that you don't have that money. So looking through these volumes, we can find widows and widowers in their 90s, unable to do physical work anymore, whose children are not nearby to care for them. We can find women in their 30s and 40s who've been deserted by their husbands and left with small children to care for. There are orphans in these records who have been taken in by relatives who just need some extra finances to feed and clothe the children they didn't expect to be looking after. There are also orphans with no family to take them in. There are people described with the words idiot, imbecile, lunatic, weak-minded, who require care either in the asylum, which the Poor Relief Fund could pay for, or care in their own home, where maybe a family member would need, again, a bit of financial support to look after that person. There are strong, fit, middle-aged men who have suffered a short-term injury, which just limits their ability to work. There are single women whose pregnancy or nursing of a baby means that they can't work. So there's all sorts of people who have hit on either a short or an indefinite period of struggle, which has forced them to the indignity, as they would see it, of having to ask for help. And as I say, asking for help from a system that really would try not to be responsible if it didn't have to, because it had limited funds. In the records of Clyne Parochial Board, I found the case of Christy Grant. Christy Grant lived in Badnellen with her husband George Sutherland, and it was he who applied for poor relief for her. She was 92 when he applied, on the 10th of April 1860. He is described as an aged man who still does country work and is the catechist of the parish. So again, we get an insight into the fact that in their 90s he's still working full-time effectively. George's work is relevant, so although the claim is for Christie, George's work is relevant. In the column headed Other Information to enable the parochial board to decide the case, it says, this woman appears to be disabled to earn a livelihood, but, so they're saying, yes, we absolutely see that there's no way she can work. But the The board, considering that her husband has a lot of land, as in a certain, not a huge amount, but a lot of land, a section of land, at a nominal rent, a £6 salary as catechist, and emoluments appertaining to that office, refused her claim. So although she is 92 and they say she is disabled and she's unable to make any money, her husband's small salary, which works out at about £350 a year today, disqualifies her from getting that support. If we go forward a few years, we can see that in November 1865, a 22-year-old married man, Alexander Simpson, applied for help. It's recorded that at the time of applying, he was staying in the lodging house, East Brora. And Alexander was given temporary relief, so he wasn't put on the official poor roll, but he was given something to tide him over while the inspector saw him. And I wanted to share it here because his entry is a great example of how much information these records can reveal about an individual. So again, under that column, any other information that can be used to help the parochial board decide its case, I found this. And you tell me where else you would ever find this level of information about Alexander's life. 22 years old. He was born in the parish of Liberton, Edinburgh, resided in Liberton until 12 years of age, in Liberton and Lasswade various periods until 16 years of age. In Glasgow, 4 months, in Dumbarton, 9 months, in Greenock, 5 months, in Leith, 3 years, in Kinghorn Poor House for 7 days, in Leith, 6 weeks, in Alloa, 3 weeks, in Glasgow, 12 months, in Leith, 5 months, Pittenweem, 2 months, in Clyne, 3 days. Father, George Simpson. Mother, Jemima Baines. Father was relieved in the Kinghorn Poorhouse before him. So where else would we get that record? 22 years old, and he has gone. He's the sort of person, if you've done your family history, who's a total nightmare to trace because it's always somewhere different. And then you're going, is this the same person? But look at that across Edinburgh, Glasgow, Greenock, Dumbarton, Alloa, Kinghorn, Fife, Pittenweem, just completely extraordinary. And if he hadn't claimed on that one day, would we ever have known all of that about his life? On the 28th of September 1874, in the same volume, I found the application of Anne Sutherland from Brora. She recorded as a single domestic servant aged 16 who has been forced to claim after giving birth to a child who is now 2 months old. The inspector notes this about Anne. She charges George Murray, labourer, Clyne Milton, with paternity of her child. Applicant is the daughter of James Sutherland, fisherman, Golspie, now deceased. Her mother is alive in Golspie. Applicant, not having made a settlement in this parish. Golspie appears to be the parish of settlement. Just feel there's something sad there about a 16-year-old with a baby a couple of months old and being put into the situation of having to claim for poor relief. Anne was given support. She was given support at 1 shilling per week. And when I looked into her entry in the General Register of Poor, it says that she was later offered poorhouse, and that's all it says. There are examples in the Sutherland records, as you might expect given the amount of coast, of fishermen and fisherwomen struck down with either loss of trade, there are times where they say they've got a herring boat but she doesn't have the right kind of boat to go out with the fish that's around at that point. But there are examples of fishermen and fisherwomen struck down with typhoid fever. One example records multiple generations of the same house, the same family, living at different ends of a house who are unable to do anything for themselves temporarily and are relieved because of it. So again, some examples there of people in their 90s, young women with a young child, middle-aged working population who are temporarily unable to do any work. So those are all from Clyne. If we move to Assynt, like Clyne, we have a great range of record types. We have application records, we have minutes, we have the general registers of the poor, which means that we can trace a story through. I found a particularly sad entry on the 15th of December 1904, the application of Angus MacLeod, an 84-year-old widowed labourer with no earnings at all. His entry includes the words, "Applicant has been living in the same house in Assynt all his life. His family have forsaken him." There's another octogenarian the following year who was put forward by 5 of his neighbours, and there are entries sometimes that say that people have been put forward out of compassion or out of motives of mercy. So this extract, his notes say that he has lived in this parish for his whole lifetime. Applicant was a crofter until last year, when owing to poverty and old age he had to give it up. His horse died recently and his cattle were given for debt to Mr. Ross of Drumbeck. He is quite destitute and needs relief. It's interesting sometimes when you see that people are not applying for themselves, but that other people are applying on their behalf. Maybe that shows, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, but sometimes I wonder if it shows the level of pride involved, that people don't want to have to do that, and then their neighbours, out of pity, say, look, you have to get some kind of support here. References there to the fact that that his horse had died and his cattle had been given away. Probably if he had still had the horse and cattle, even though he is destitute and aged mid-80s, whatever his age is, he probably wouldn't have been given the relief because he would have had something that he could have used. Now, I've mentioned that sometimes in the church records, poor relief was given in practical ways rather than in finance. And we see that continuing through to the official poor relief system as well. So the minutes of Assynt Parochial Board, or Parish Council as it would have been by then, 22nd of December 1904, really illustrate the way that the parochial boards and the parish councils still tried to give practical support as well as financial. So here are some extracts. The house of widow John Mackenzie store to be thatched, and the inspector to insist upon Angus Mackenzie removing his stock from her house. The house of Marion Mackenzie, Achnacarnan, was also ordered to be thatched. The council approved of the inspector's arrangement for completing the former houses. The end of the house, where widow Angus MacLeod lives, ordered to be provided with thatch, Murdo Mackenzie being understood to thatch it gratis. It was also agreed to grant a sum of 35 shillings per year for supplying fire to the said widow Angus MacLeod. The inspector was authorised to get the house of Angus and Alex MacLeod Achmelvich thatched as cheaply as possible. The inspector was authorised to get the poor house at Clashmore tarred and felted where required, when weather permitted. So again, those references to the practical ways that people can help. And we still see that today if you think of our state system, for those of us in the UK anyway, where there are winter fuel payments to people who might not be able to adequately heat their house without it. So there's still that overlap between finance and practical support. Now, I've mentioned a few times as I've been going through people's length of time in the parish, if they've lived somewhere all their life, or I mentioned with that 16-year-old girl that it would have to be her mother's parish she claimed from because she wasn't settled. And that was to ensure that people were entitled to claim from the parish they were claiming from. Had they been born there? Had their parents been born there? Had they been resident for a certain number of years? And so we often see discussions about this within the minutes, discussions about who is liable for this person, whose responsibility is it. And I've said how sometimes they'll try and shift the responsibility to other people, and you see that with parishes as well, that they will say, well, it's definitely Golspie, and Golspie will say it's definitely Wick and Wicker. You know, it goes round and round right across the country as well, that you'll see that movement or that transfer of responsibility. In the Darnus General Register of the Poor, I found a 2-month-old baby. She's on her own in the record. She's called Sophia, and it just says that she had been born in the maternity hospital in Edinburgh and had been deserted by both of her parents. So it's interesting to think that at that point in the late 1800s, this baby has been born in Edinburgh, and the work that has been done to work out who she is and where she's connected to. So it goes on then later to say her mother's birthplace appears to have been Darnus, and that's why the baby has been charged to Darnus. 10 months later, on her entry when she was 1, she was 2 months at the time that the record starts, when she was 1, she ceased to be chargeable to the parish. She was dismissed from the poorhouse and into her mother's care. And that's all it says, and you wonder what the situation is, if the mother's situation had changed, had she wanted to desert the child or not. In Louth, so if that's quite unusual, finding a child deserted and then transferred back from Edinburgh, in Louth parish I found something even more unusual. There's a domestic servant, and it says that she is claiming for her second bastard. The board refuse her claim, noting that she is only partially disabled because she's nursing and caring for a child. She is a prostitute and she will sustain herself and the child, it says. So there's something there that's giving a very strong opinion. It would be interesting to see what would have happened if she had claimed, or she had gone to the church for help prior to the poor relief system. They say that there's no father to support her. It's also interesting that they just say she's a prostitute and will sustain herself. But a later entry notes that they did agree to pay 6pence a week until the child is weaned. But it's very unusual. Certainly I haven't found many references to prostitution. It would be interesting to look through the poor relief records and see if there are others. Also in the parish of Louth, I found another example of why somebody's family couldn't help them. And this ties into last week's Learn with Lorna. So John Clark of Portgower, a 67-year-old shepherd widower, is given support chargeable to the parish of Wick because this is what the research into his family showed. So the parish is looking around, seeing who else could be responsible for him, who else could pay, and this is what they find. It says, he has children. Hector, 40, shepherd, out of employment with 5 children. So Hector probably can't afford. Mary, 37, servant girl in Melbourne. Elizabeth, 35, married to John Mackenzie from Rogart, both now in Australia. Alexandrina, 30, servant in Australia. Jane, 28, servant in Australia. John, 25, shepherd in Geelong. So every single one of his family is unable to support him because the vast majority of them are on the other side of the earth. And it's just really interesting to get that social history and that personal history of that one family as well. And as I was chatting about with one of my colleagues yesterday, what a huge number of people from one family to just suddenly disappear. Lots of great examples within the Louth parish records, actually. I found the woman who, it says she is a woman who worked for a lady in London for 22 years before that lady died. She then married and lived in London before coming back to claim for help from Louth. So again, maybe you wouldn't find that information anywhere else. But I think I'll finish with my favourite extract that made me, it's very, very unusual that poor relief makes you smile or makes you laugh. But I found an entry that said, is a man claiming for poor relief, and they say that they don't know how old he is. The man thinks he might be 77 and he certainly looks it. So imagine if that was your legacy. So I hope that that's been interesting. I hope you can see the wealth of information we can get from poor relief records, whether that is at the time that the church is supporting or that start of the welfare state, the transfer to the state looking after people. And then when we go into that standard set of records of the applications, the general registers and so on, you start to find all that information about families, about individuals, and about what's happening in a community to make so many people need support. So I hope you have enjoyed that. Next week we will be looking at diaries again. I think next week will be pre-recorded because I'm going into a secondary school. I'm going in 7 more secondary school visits before Christmas. So I think that'll have to be pre-recorded unless I can run back at high speed from the school. So we'll see. But anyway, I hope you can join me next week for another delve into diary records. Thank you very much. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very, very grateful for that. Thank you, and thank you for all your comments as always.